Okay, guys. So last night was Biden's big test. This news conference that was essentially set up to save the candidacy of President Biden. And I will say it was somewhat of a mixed bag. Let's take a listen first to one of the moments where he's talking about the war in Gaza, and it sounded like a totally normal press conference.
So there's a lot of things, in retrospect, I wish I had been able to convince the Israelis to do. But the bottom line is we have a chance now. It's time to end this war.
And then here is one of the more cringe moments.
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
So here he's mixing up the name of the vice president and his opponent. Aaron and Hannah, on a scale of 1 to 10, like what level flub was that?
In isolation, it's like a 3, but next to everything else, it's probably like a 7.
Yeah, I hard agree.
You know, people are talking how he had a really good press conference, but it was clearing a pretty low bar that he had set for himself.
I think that if you had doubts about Biden, you still have them. You still maybe want him off the ticket, but there's enough there that it's much harder for them to push him out.
Welcome to The Campaign Moment. It's Friday, July 12th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, author of the Campaign Moment newsletter and senior political reporter. Today, we're joined by Hannah Knowles, a national reporter here at The Post who covers campaigns.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, as we just heard, President Biden is currently trying very hard to shut down doubts about his candidacy. But the one thing I want to note here is that we have been spending a lot of time on the Democrats' internal party drama, and there have been some really important developments on the Republican side, too. And Hannah, I know that you've been following what's going on. What has your reporting looked like in the last couple of weeks, and what are some of the things that you want to unpack in this conversation?
Well, it's all been the lead up to the Republican National Convention, which is happening next week in Milwaukee. That's where Donald Trump will formally receive the Republican nomination. And it'll really give us a sense of like, what does the Republican Party stand for right now? What could come after Trump? Like, who are the rising stars? It's such an interesting moment to ask that question after, Trump has just dominated Republican politics for so many years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to come back to all that later in today's conversation. We'll talk about the Republican National Convention, what we can expect from that. But for now, I do want to spend a few more minutes talking about Biden and how Democrats are feeling about the future of his candidacy, especially after that press conference on Thursday night. What have the reactions been that you've seen from that press conference?
I think the reaction has been pretty muted so far. There were some thoughts that maybe the dam would break after this press conference. There's less than 24 Democrats who have called for him to drop out, but there's a lot of others who are raising concerns about his ability to win the campaign. They're treating this as an open issue, even though he says that he's running. Then he gave a performance that maybe gave some of them pause. So we saw a few members coming out, Scott Peters from California, Eric Sorensen from Illinois, Jim Himes from Connecticut, even after the press conference came out and said that Biden should step down. So it is very much a state of limbo, and I'm not sure that Democrats really know what to do with this after the press conference.
I feel like it almost felt like a Rorschach test, that like everyone could see what they wanted to see in this press conference. You could see signs that this was like Biden from the debate and the kind of worst parts of his performance then and the mixing up of Harris and Trump. You could also see someone who like clearly still has a strong grasp on what his goals are in foreign policy and can talk deliberately and in detailed ways about nuances of what he thinks should happen. And then there were just like weird moments, cringy moments that I think no one really knows what to make of, particularly when it comes to like these questions about his candidacy and his response to that. And let's play one of the moments that's sticking out in my head here.
Your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying
Yeah, this was a really interesting moment. You might remember the ABC News interview from last Friday where he was asked if Trump wins, if you run and Trump wins, this thing that you've warned is such an existential threat. How would you feel? And he said, well, as long as I did as well as I could have. That really alienated Democrats, the ones who want him out at least, because it suggested that he doesn't see this as the existential threat that they talk about.
Yeah, that it's more about him and not about like whether or not he can win. It's like people don't care whether you tried that hard, your hardest or not. It's about whether you can win.
Exactly. And this answer was very much in that vein. It's like he's basically saying Harris, my Vice President Harris, which is who the question was about, even if she had a better chance to win, I'm not dropping out unless I have no chance. Like he's not saying like I'm going to give my party the best chance to win. He's saying I'm going to run unless it's a complete lost cause.
I still want to stay on some of these reactions from Democratic Party operatives and also from Hollywood, because that was the other big news this week, that George Clooney of ER fame, among many other things, came out in a New York Times op-ed and essentially said that he doesn't think Biden has it in him to run, that he saw Biden at this fundraiser shortly before the presidential debate, and that because of what he saw at that fundraiser, that he had serious doubts about Biden and his capability. And he thinks that Democrats are putting their heads in the sand if they think that he remains the right person to be the nominee. And we heard something along the same lines this morning from Ashley Judd, who wrote an opinion in USA Today calling for Biden to step down.
It's interesting, and I think it's easy to kind of play this off as like, oh, look, the famous people are, writing op-eds. It is like, who cares what famous people say? But George Clooney is somebody who is pretty close to Biden world. He held a fundraiser last month, which was kind of the subject of his comments about this. Basically, he said the Biden that they saw at that fundraiser was also kind of the one we saw at the debate, where he was kind of meandering and people couldn't really understand what he was saying. So it did kind of paint a picture that suggested the debate was not an isolated incident. It also matters for potential donors. Like, are they signaling that these people aren't going to be as strongly behind Biden moving forward? It is just something that kind of draws attention to this debate in a way that maybe casual people wouldn't otherwise consume it.
And yeah, as you say, it is so easy for Biden to dismiss, like, oh, it's just the Hollywood people who want me out. It's just the party elites who want me out. Like the real voters, real Americans are like here for me. But we do have a more complex picture of that this week because of polling that we saw coming out from. This was a Washington Post, ABC News, Ipsos poll released this week that shows that a majority of U.S. adults, and specifically a majority of Democrats, 56%, say that Biden should step aside and let someone else run.
Yeah, Biden has said in his interviews basically that this is something that the elites are pushing for. That's a word he uses. His campaign is kind of pitching this as shadowy forces who are trying to push him out, which is a very kind of valuable political picture to paint. But it's not really an accurate one, because we do see in this post-Ipsos poll that a majority of Democrats want him out. About half in other polls have said that. There's other kind of troubling signs that Democrats aren't sold on him in this poll. A clear majority of them said he was too old. Only 32% of Democrats think Biden is more mentally sharp than Trump. We also saw 36% of Democrats said that the debate made them view Biden less favorably.
And since we were talking about elites and what the elites want, I think talking to Democratic voters in Wisconsin, for example, that's where I was the other week, there are a lot of voters, and I would say a lot of younger voters, who are kind of like, the party elites are the ones who put us in this situation. And they feel that the Democratic Party, like, cleared the way for Biden. They rearranged the primary process. They kind of went along with whatever he wanted to do rather than anyone really pushing for a more competitive primary. And so they felt like the voters have wanted someone different for a long time. And you see that in polling. And it was kind of the party apparatus that took a while to catch up. Yeah.
Interesting. I do want to bring in some tape here, because I did spend a little time yesterday calling some voters. These are people who had previously responded to a Post survey and called them back. I want to be clear, this is not like a scientific survey on my part, and just a few people who happened to pick up who are likely Biden voters, who are some of them are Democrats, some of them weren't. But In the handful of folks that I talked to, it did seem pretty consistent that people said they wanted Biden out of the race and they didn't feel that he was up to it anymore. So I want to play tape from a couple of those voters. First is Julian Shermis, who's 33 and from Henderson, Nevada.
I think it's best if Biden does step aside. And if it was just aging or if he was a little bit slow or maybe misspoke every now and then, that'd be one thing. But, the rate at which he's been declining lately is alarming. As far as running the country for the next 4 years, I even have concerns. I don't think Biden's is up for it.
And then there's also another voter, Grace Griffin, who's 24 and from Calumet, Michigan.
I'll still vote for him if he's the Democratic Party nominee. But I'd rather the Democratic Party find someone else.
And who would that someone else be? Like, who would you want to see?
I'm not really sure. Honestly, if Michelle Obama ran, I'd be so happy.
I love how often that comes up. Like, if only Michelle Obama would run for president.
Or even Barack Obama. I've gotten Barack Obama when I ask people, who do you want to run?
That is unconstitutional.
That's not lawful, but Michelle Obama, I don't want to go down the Michelle Obama rabbit hole here because it's not going to happen. But there have been polls of these alternatives here, and the only one who runs appreciably better than Biden is Michelle Obama, who led by double digits in a Reuters poll. So, yeah, that's if Democrats had their druthers and could convince somebody who's not at all interested in being a candidate to run, she would be it.
Yeah. But this is a nuance that I think is reflected in this poll and also in some of the stuff that I heard from these voters is that they are they think that he should step out, but they're still going to vote for him. And I feel like it sounds like that's what Biden is kind of banking on, is that, yes, Democrats, a lot of them maybe don't want to see him run, but that when it comes to who they're actually going to vote for, and if enough Democrats are going to come out to vote simply because he is going to be the option against Trump, that they will be there for him in the end.
I think the problem is it feels to a lot of people like the debate performance really puts a ceiling on how much he can grow. And heading into that debate, there was this sense among Democrats that, Donald Trump kind of had the upper hand. The polling was all close, but he did seem to have an edge. And the idea was we're going to do this early debate to change the trajectory of the race. And now it just feels like, how do you win those people that we were counting on, convincing of the president's strength and vitality?
Yeah, and it's also worth noting, if 95% of his voters stay on board, but 5% are alienated by this issue, he loses. You are fighting over a very small segment of voters who are going to determine this election, often voters who don't like either candidate. It's about 1 in 5 voters in this country who don't like either candidate. And so they're choosing between the lesser of two evils. And this issue is giving them a data point to make that decision. So if they don't like Trump for whatever reason, but they see this as a major issue for Biden, that's a significant part of the calculus for them.
All right, so let's take a break there. Then afterwards, we're going to talk about the Trump campaign, the latest on how they've been trying to capitalize on these last couple of weeks since the debate, and what to expect from the Republican National Convention next week. We'll be right back.
So, Hannah, is it just me, or has Trump been very quiet for Donald Trump since the debate a couple of weeks ago?
Yes, it's been a weird couple of weeks in Trump land, right? Because we're all used to Trump dominating the headlines and Biden being sort of the quieter candidate. But Trump is really just kind of laid low while all this drama is unfolding in the Democratic Party. And I think
which, just for the record, is incredible.
Right? Which is a major achievement for him and his operation. And I think that's absolutely what, his allies would advise him to do at this moment, right? And actually, it kind of echoes what happened during the debate. Everyone had advised Donald Trump, just like shut up and don't interrupt Biden like you did in that famous debate they had in 2020. Like, just let him talk. And it worked out better than they could have imagined, because the Biden who showed up was not, the Biden from the State of the Union. And that was the story of the debate. And so coming out of the debate, I was at like the first rally that Trump did right after that. And he took a victory lap, but he wasn't going on for an hour about how bad Biden was. He tried to talk about immigration and he tried to talk about the economy. It was kind of like a disciplined policy speech in some ways. Granted, that's like very much on a curve. Like, he still went on all these crazy tangents, but it does feel like it's been sort of a disciplined operation recently.
The Trump campaign does not want to feed into getting Biden out of the race right now. There's some reporting that the Trump campaign views Biden as their preferable opponent, that he's easier to beat, and they don't want to kind of nudge this along in any way. And so
like that in some ways, like, the fallout for Democrats is actually too good for Republicans, and that it might mess things up for them in the long term if Democrats rethink the candidate.
Yeah. I think there is certainly a theory, and judging by Trump's lack of too much on this topic, I think it's valid. The Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign have been spending months tweeting out these flubs endlessly, and it's slowed down a little bit in a way that I think is suggestive, even when this is such a big topic of conversation.
And in terms of this idea that, like, okay, things are headed in the right direction for them, and as long as Biden remains the candidate, like, this will be a good election for them, are they justified in that confidence?
I do think that they feel like Kamala Harris is still an opponent where they have a lot to work with. She's very easy to tie to Biden. But I think they feel like the race is going a good way. And so why shake that up? Why inject uncertainty into it? I don't know. Aaron, what do you think?
It's so hard to know these days, because the polls have proven to be off, and also because we're so polarized. I mean, it was 8 years ago that members of a political party were calling for their nominee to drop out very late in the campaign. That was Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape, and not every Republican, but lots of Republicans thought he was cooked. Like, they thought it was over. And then a month later, he won the election. It's a situation where our country is so polarized and the polling is so uncertain because of low response rates that you just can't say anything with certainty. And that's why if you're the Biden campaign, can tell yourself and convince yourself and maybe convince people that they should just kind of stay the course, because, maybe we're not getting an accurate picture of the race right now.
I think it is easy in this moment to say, like, Democrats are the ones with all the problems right now, or Democrats are, have this internal divide about the future. But Hannah, you have been reporting recently on some discord inside the GOP, and especially ahead of the Republican National Convention next week. Of course, that's going to be when Donald Trump officially accepts the nomination as the party's candidate for president, and the delegates will ratify their platform. But specifically, when it comes to their platform, that there are some questions around what that platform actually says.
Yeah, so Trump has very much embraced this idea that the states should regulate abortion, and he's declined to make a national abortion ban part of his platform, even though some of his supporters, some activists, would really like to see that, even though this is still like a centerpiece of Democrats' campaign. I mean, they'll say you can't trust Trump on abortion, because I remember, like, at the 2020 debate, Trump said Roe's not on the ballot. Why would Roe be on the ballot? And, 2 years later, we see what happened. So, like, Democrats still have plenty to work with, but Trump is trying to blunt that message, and his team signaled a couple weeks ago that they wanted to dramatically cut down the Republican Party platform to just give their critics less ammunition, less stuff to put in attack ads. And one of the things that got chopped was a call to amend the Constitution to say that fetuses, or as anti-abortion activists would call it, the unborn, that they have the same rights as any person.
So Trump's campaign is basically like, we don't need to talk about this, and like let's hew to the middle when it comes to abortion. But it sounds like some Republicans feel kind of railroaded by that, like that they say this is a core part of our party, and like, how can you just give up on that?
Yeah, and I talked to some people who were part of the committee that was assembled to, work on this draft platform, and One woman I talked to, she's been part of this process for many years. She's done it before. She knows how it usually works. And this year it was very different. Usually they have subcommittees that kind of workshop the language and they propose amendments. And they were told they would have subcommittees, but then they show up and those subcommittees don't do anything. They get there. They're told to give their phones away. They're given, copies of the draft, and they're not really given time to digest it or talk about it. And soon someone's calling, okay, let's vote on it. And it passes. I think there is a lot of dissent about how that process played out. But at the end of the day, these people are very much behind Trump. I don't see this as like a major issue for the Republican Party's unity.
Yeah, I think that you're probably going to see at least some chatter about this at the convention. But it really it encapsulates the fact that the Republican Party has basically become Trump. The idea that abortion is murder was basically the Republican Party's platform for a lot of years. And the logical extent of their position now is basically like, we're not going to try too hard to ban this at the national level. Trump is not even taking a position on the state level bans and how far they should go. And so it does create a tension. And I think it's interesting because the pro-life movement is kind of letting this get away from them to some degree.
So, of course, this is like a more limited platform that folks are going to be looking at and talking about during the RNC. But, of course, there's also this longer-term platform of what actually happens if Trump becomes president again. And a lot of this is centered on talk about Project 2025, which is like one of those things that I had not heard of up until like a week ago. And now everyone is talking about Project 2025 and what it is and why it's so scary, I think, to a lot of people. Hannah, can you talk a little bit about what Project 2025 is?
Yes. So it's a effort by a bunch of conservative groups. It's led by the Heritage Foundation to lay out in very exhaustive detail what they want the next conservative presidential administration to do, and also to line up people who could fill all these key roles. And I think a lot of the angst that Trump has about his first term is that there were a lot of people who didn't want to carry out his ideas and prevented some of those ideas from taking place. And so there is this sense of like, we need people ready to go who are our people.
We're going to, now that we've done this once before, we know where we went wrong. We know how we can hit the ground running this time.
We want loyalists who will carry out our vision and believe in our vision.
And just to be clear, Trump has said on social media that he is not on board with Project 2025. He said that he knew nothing about the project and called some of the ideas in it, quote, ridiculous and abysmal. But there is the sense that people who are aligned with Trump and who Trump sees as his chief allies, that they are working on this and they are trying to put this plan into place.
Yeah, well, and so that's the fascinating development. I think his team has been mad for a while that they were getting lumped in with Project 2025, and they kind of sent them a lot of signals of like, hey, back off, like only we speak for our platform. And now clearly they've decided that's not enough.
And before we keep going, I just want to, because I think this is important, understanding the stakes of this and also the stakes of what it could look like if Trump becomes president. I just want to read a section from Hannah, your story, explaining what Project 2025 is trying to put in place. Quote, the exhaustive plan calls for, among other things, dismantling the education department, passing sweeping tax cuts, imposing sharp limits on abortion, giving the White House greater influence over the Justice Department, reducing efforts to limit climate change, increasing efforts to promote fossil fuels, drastically cutting and changing the federal workforce, and giving the president more power over the civil service. So that's what they're talking about.
It's a really kind of bold or extreme, depending on how you view it, vision for moving forward. I think it's important to also mention, like, Trump says he has nothing to do with this. This is a lot of people from his administration. There's a CNN report this week that said that it was 140 people from his administration have been involved in this. Wow. 6 of his cabinet secretaries. Back in 2022, Trump keynoted a dinner for the Heritage Foundation when it was starting to work on these kinds of things, and basically said that this group is going to be putting together the groundwork and detailed plans for exactly what our movement will do. So it's hard to completely distance himself from this. And I think there's really a question of like, how much is he putting this aside for political reasons, but it actually represents his agenda? There's a lot of overlap in what this group, what this plan is putting forward and what Trump has said personally. So it's hard to completely distance himself from.
So there's one last piece of Republican news, or I guess a question in the air that we're all wondering that I do want to talk about before we wrap today. And that is Trump's vice presidential pick. We are expecting that to take place possibly in the next day or two before the Republican National Convention, which is next week in Milwaukee. And there are apparently, according to our reporting, 3 frontrunners. That's Senator Marco Rubio, Senator J.D. Vance, and Governor Doug Burgum. Tell me a little bit about like where the prognostications are at of like who he's going to pick, what's people's money on, and what are the potential benefits of each of these candidates.
Yeah, so my colleagues have reported that Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance were really kind of at the center of the discussions early this week. But like every bit of reporting that we do on this beat, it's like it always comes with this huge caveat of like Trump is infamously unpredictable. Like he changes his mind. He could just, tweet it out, or I guess truth it out these days, So I think that we don't have much more insight than that right now.
Marco Rubio makes sense if the idea is to win by, expanding the appeal of the ticket. He's a more establishment-oriented politician who maybe appeals to some of those Nikki Haley voters in the Republican primaries. I think J.D. Vance is like the governing, I want to go full MAGA pick. He's very much in line with that worldview. And then I think Burgum is kind of like we're just going to pick something super safe here. I think in recent days and kind of the increasing optimism of the Trump campaign could push them towards somebody like Vance. I think he's the one that people generally think is the most likely. Again, we don't know because things can surprise us. And I do wonder how much Trump would trust Marco Rubio as his vice president.
We're imagining that he thinks Rubio is like wants to become president and is like going to be looking for any opportunity to kind of advance his own interests.
And also, the example of Mike Pence, who was also an establishment Republican, who for 4 years very obsequiously served as Trump's vice president. And then when the rubber hit the road on January 6th, did not do what Trump wanted him to. I have a hard time believing that Trump would completely trust Rubio in that role to not do what Pence eventually did. And, I think that's a very big consideration for them.
I think that's a really good point about like loyalty. I mean, J.D. Vance is just like at this point sort of the essence of what Trump wants his surrogates to be. I mean, he will just go out there and defend everything that Trump says and does. And he also has some influential people vouching for him. He has the president's son, Don Jr., really saying that he would be a good pick.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how it all plays out. I think we have to leave it there. But Hannah and Aaron, thank you guys both so much for being here today. And I'll see you in just a couple of days in Wisconsin.
See ya.
See you there.
And in the meantime, make sure that you are subscribing to the Campaign Moment newsletter, which Aaron is the author of.
Yeah, we'll have a lot of newsletters next week, so now is definitely the time to be signing up.
And you can find the link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. Hannah Knowles is a national politics reporter covering campaigns for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter. That's it for this week on the Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, you know that we are bringing you these conversations most Fridays. But if you're not following the Campaign Moment podcast itself, you are missing out. We had a great episode earlier this week with a behind-the-scenes look at the Biden campaign, and we're going to have more episodes next week at the RNC about Trump's vice presidential pick, much more, and a lot of that will be exclusive to the Campaign Moment podcast. So if you have not yet followed the Campaign Moment podcast in your podcast app, this is the moment to do that. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Lucy Perkins, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovskiy, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Trinity Webster Bass, Ali Bianco, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Elahe Izadi. I'm Martine Powers. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.